Hello and welcome to the Friday lecture series at the European Centre here in Chapel Hill. My name is Sophie. I'm a graduate student in the Transatlantic Masters Programme, and I'm very happy to present to you today's speaker, Dr. Jae-Jae Spoon from the University of Texas. With the European elections coming up next year, she will talk to us a bit about the dynamics of the elections, the parties and the voters. Currently an assistant professor at the University of North Texas, she has previously worked at the University of Mannheim and the University of Iowa. She gained her bachelor and PhD in political science at the University of Michigan. And as an undergraduate, she spent a year in Montpellier, France, where she witnessed the presidential elections, which sparked her interest in European party politics. In 2011, she has published a book on the political survival of small parties in Europe. She has also published numerous articles on party and voting behaviors in Europe. Her special research interests are French politics and small parties. Please welcome with me Dr. Jae-Jae Spoon.
Thank you all, and thanks for coming today. As Sophie said, I'm going to be talking to you a bit today about European Parliament elections, and sort of at the end, sort of talk a little bit about some research I've done on this, and at the end, sort of speculate a little bit in terms of what I think is going to happen in the 2014 election, and we can talk more about that at the end. So we'll get started. So this is something that probably we're all somewhat familiar with. This is sort of the outline of what the party makeup in the European Parliament looks like. And as we know, when voters go and vote, they're voting for their national parties, and then those members of Parliament join with with international cross-national party groups. And so we have the two largest parties. You can't really see this one down here. Party groups are the EPP, which is the Conservative Party, right, made up of most of the conservative parties in Europe, except with the notable exception, which is the British Conservative Party, which is not in the European People's Party. They are in a somewhat Eurosceptic group, which is the ACR, there we go, and they're over here. And then the PES, which is down here in red, which sort of is made up by all of the socialist parties, the center-left, the large socialist parties. And as we might expect, right, these are the two largest party groups in the European Parliament. But like in most European countries, right, it's a multi-party institution, and so we have national parties from across the spectrum forming various party groups. The second largest one are the Liberals, the ALDE group right here, and they have about 11% of the seats in Parliament. The next sort of largest is the Green group, which is not in green, it's in purple, but they have about 8% of the seats. And then we have other smaller groups. So this is sort of the makeup of the European Parliament, and today this is 766 seat Parliament since the accession of Croatia this summer. So it's getting bigger, although at some point it will stop growing. So this is the makeup. And what's the interesting question then becomes, what does voting in these elections look like, right? Who votes? Do votes look the same? Do people vote differently, etc.? And there's been a lot of research done on this starting in the early 1980s, right after the first European Parliament election in '79. And we can generalize the elections to the European Parliament that happen every 5 years in this way. So I've just given you sort of a few points, and we can look at this lovely little cartoon up here of the guy walking past the voting place, yawning during the European Parliament election. Okay, so just to sort of set the stage for that, so we know that turnout is lower, right? Turnout in European Parliament elections tends to be lower than it is in national elections. And this graph here just shows you sort of over time what turnout has looked like in the European Parliament elections. And we see that it's gone down, right? Started out in '79 at 62%, and in the last election, it was 43%, right? So quite lower than national elections in many European countries, although obviously from the US perspective, not that low, but still. And interestingly, it has gone down, right? And so we generally see, like we do in many sort of founding elections, that first election, that there's a lot of turnout. People are really excited about this sort of new institution, and we see this pattern happening in new democracies. First election, second election, turnout is really high. People are very excited, they get to vote, they have choice. in this case, something new and different in the early 70s, early 80s, late 70s, and that for those sort of founding member states, turnout has gone down. And we sort of see that same thing as new countries come in. That first election is often higher in turnout, and then it goes down. Although the East European countries, turnout really has never been that high. So they've sort of an interesting aside to that. We also know that smaller parties do better. And so when voters go and vote, they're typically punishing the governing parties, whether it's the party that's actually in government or the large opposition party, right, that may have been recently in government. So they tend to punish both the government, the actual government, but just the larger parties in general, and tend to vote for smaller parties. And so we see in the European Parliament representatives from smaller parties that don't have representation in their national governments. Parties like the Greens, for example, parties like the UK Independence Party, that we see they have representation in the European Parliament elections. And so that kind of gives us a bit of a sense of what these elections look like that voters in all member states vote for in every 5 years. So the question, though, is what do people do in these elections, right? And so they have sort of three choices, right? They can vote for the same party, right, which we call a partisan, right? You vote for the socialists in your national election, you vote for the socialists in the European Parliament election, right? So you continue voting in the same way. Or you can vote for another party, right? And this is where we may see smaller parties doing better. You voted for the socialists are in government, you're not real happy with the socialists, so to send a signal to the governing party, you vote for the Greens, right? And that's what we call a switcher, right? Somebody who switches in European Parliament elections. And then, right, and we know we have lots of those, given the turnout information I just showed you, you can abstain, right? These are what are called second-order elections, right? And we tend to find that turnout generally is lower in second-order elections, right? People care less. In the case of the European Parliament, there's been lots of debate and discussion how much voters in Europe actually know what the European Parliament does, what their members of the European Parliament, their MEPs actually do. And it seems sort of like a distant, faraway place, Brussels, right, or Strasbourg, right? So they tend not to vote as much. And we call those individuals abstainers. Okay, so those are the sort of three options. And so the question then is, what determines these different choices? What makes somebody more likely to vote for the same party? What makes them more likely to switch? And what makes them more likely to abstain? And we can think about all sorts of things that might influence what influences people's vote choice. And that can be, and I've put some of these up here, right, the role of the parties, right? People taking cues from their parties, the other parties, etc., their ideology, in other words, having a strong position on something and whether that is how that relates to the parties in government or to smaller parties out of government. Then it can be something that's clearly just a signal, to send a signal, right? I don't like what my government is doing, and so I'm going to vote against them, right? In the U.S. context, we call this the midterm election effect, right? It's the same idea. You don't like what the president's party is doing, you vote for a different party in the midterm elections. So this is sort of the same idea. And then obviously there's a lot of priming that can be going on, right? The media can play a big role here. In other words, is the media supportive of the government? Is the media supportive of the European Union, of European integration? And how that can prime your vote choice, right? So all of these things, right, these kinds of things, some of these influence vote choice in any election, but specifically in the European Parliament elections is how, what we're sort of thinking about in terms of how these are influencing things. Okay, so what I want to sort of talk about now is some research that I've done with a co-author, Sarah Hobolt, who's at the London School of Economics, really trying to look at what is motivating voters, right? What's motivating them to switch, right? To not vote for the same party or to abstain. And sort of how do all of these individual level types of things, which we'll talk about, as well as the context, how does that affect what's going on? So I think I sent a paper around, and you probably all saw it if you looked at it. This was in there. So this, again, is just sort of a kind of graphical depiction to sort of start us out in terms of what's going to influence the behavior of a voter in a European election, okay? So we've got the motivations, right, in terms of what's motivating a voter, right? And so we can think about two types of motivations. A sincere motivation, right, is going to be about ideology. Right, is going to be about voting for a party that I agree with, that has a similar ideological position as me, or conversely, not voting for a party that doesn't have that, right? That's a sort of a sincere vote. It can also be a protest vote, which is, I'm not thinking about sort of the issues at hand. I'm not thinking about Europe or European integration, but I just don't like the party that's in power, right? I don't like the socialists, or I don't like the party necessarily that's out of power, but that was recently in power, right? So we think of that as kind of a protest vote, right? How satisfied somebody is with their own government. And remember, right, this is voting at the supranational level, but taking that opinion of what's going on nationally and then transferring it to the supranational level, right? So we have these two kinds of motivations at the individual level. And then we can think about the arena, right? So are voters thinking about domestic politics, right? Or are they thinking about European politics? And we can sort of unpack this a little bit more, and I'll do that in a minute, and look at how we can be a sincere voter thinking about Europe, we can be a sincere voter thinking about national politics, or we can be a more sort of instrumental protest voter thinking about European or domestic politics. And then all of this together then leads the voter to either vote for the same party, vote for a different party, or decide, you know what, I'm just going to stay home. Okay, so from this, what obviously we're thinking about, as we're sort of developing a research question, is kind of coming up then with a series of hypotheses, right? A series of expectations of how we think these things are going to affect what the voter does. And so we have a series of hypotheses here. Apparently the colors don't translate. There should be color up there so you can see. And again, putting all of these things together, okay? So we have two different types of domestic voting, okay? So voters are thinking about domestic politics, but sometimes it's based on a protest, and sometimes it's based on ideology, okay? So the first one we call sort of a sincere domestic voter. And this person is basically saying, okay, if I voted for a specific party in the national election, and I identify, right, I'm sort of close to them on the left-right dimension, right? I place myself, let's say, at a 6 out of 10, where 10 is the most conservative or the most right, 0 or 1 is the most left. I put myself at about a 6. The party that I voted for is about a 6. So I'm less likely to switch or abstain, right? I'm going to just keep voting how I voted, right? Which makes sense. I like what the party's doing. I feel close to the party. So why do I change anything? Okay, so that's sort of that sincere, right, focusing on ideology, but thinking about domestic politics. And then we can have the protest voter, who's looking at the government and saying, I voted socialist last time, and I don't like what they're doing, right? I don't like their economic policy. I don't like their education policy. So I'm going to do something different, okay? And so we call this a protest voter because it's very much in relation to the government at hand and sending a signal that I don't like what you're doing. So a very instrumental kind of voter. So this is a protest voter. And then on the EU side, we have the same types of voters. So these are voters that are thinking about Europe, right, as opposed to thinking about domestic politics. And so again, the sincere voter is saying, okay, I voted for this party. This is where I put myself on a European integration dimension. Let's say from 0 to 10, 10 being very much in favor of European integration. I put myself at about a 7, 0 being very much opposed to European or further European integration. And my party is about there too. Right? So the closer, again, this sincere connection between you and the party, I'm going to continue voting for that party. But the reason we call this an EU voter is because they're thinking about the European dimension when they're going to vote. They're not thinking about sort of left-right domestic politics. Okay. All right, so where are we? 4. The fourth expectation, or the fourth type of voter, is what we call the protest EU voter. Right? So again, this is someone who's dissatisfied with the European Union, with the national government's, let's say, position on the European Union, or just the European Union more generally. And again, to send a signal, right, we're going to vote for a different party, or we're going to abstain. Right? So all of these, right, the expectation is, again, either abstaining or switching, depending on how sort of close or far away. Okay, so those are our sort of 4 voters that are, we're just looking at sort of individual preferences. And then we look at something a bit more complicated, right? Because we know that voters are not just sort of isolated, not being affected at all by what's going on around them, right? That would be a very simplistic view of the world. So we want to actually try and think about the world as it actually is, which is that you have your own preferences. In other words, your own positions on Europe, your own positions on the left-right spectrum, but that sits in a larger context of what the parties more generally are doing, what the media is generally doing. And so we argue that obviously that context is going to influence what your predisposition is as a voter, okay? And that's what we call sort of an interaction effect, right? Two things are interacting with each other. So the first one is that the more politicized the issue of European integration is. And what politicization means is just that this is something that's being talked about, right? This is something that the media is talking about, that the parties are talking about, but that importantly, they have different positions, right? Something isn't hugely politicized if everybody agrees on it, right? It becomes politicized if one party has one position and another party has another position, and then it becomes very heightened, right? And very much in the political rhetoric, parties are talking about it, leaders are talking about it, the media is talking about it, etc. So the more politicized the issue of Europe is, if you're already far away from your party on the issue of Europe, you're going to be more likely to switch your vote. Okay, so it's basically saying that what I had said before about that sincere voter, but that it's going to be heightened in that certain environment. And then the last one is about politicization as well, but it's about that protest vote. And again, the idea of something being more politicized, the more that your dissatisfaction with the EU is going to be heightened, and the more likely you're to vote differently. Okay, so it's just putting that protest voter in that context where things are politically heightened. Okay, so we have these sort of speculations about what we think voters are going to do. We have sort of different voters in different contexts. And then the question now is, all right, how do we figure this out, right? How do we kind of try and get to the bottom of what's going on? We look at a blank screen is what we do. Okay, we look at survey data. And we have a couple of surveys that we use that are quite useful for this. And these are surveys that are done across Europe, asking voters how they vote in the European elections. We look at the 2009 European election study, but the nice thing about this is if we were interested, we could look at voters from 1979 to 2009, because this survey is asked, is done every 5 years. So that gives us, if we were interested, kind of in an over time, how voters have changed. And in other work, we've done a little bit of that as well. But that's how we figure out how people voted. Right? What their opinions are of their national party, what their opinions are of Europe, what their, if they're satisfied with government. And we know how they voted in the European election, as well as how they voted in their national election, right? Or if they voted, right? So that we can see if they've switched or they've abstained. Obviously, surveys are quite useful, but they're, of course, not without problems. Because somebody may have voted, may have abstained, but they don't want to tell you that, because the stigma of not voting. So, they're not perfect, but it's sort of the best way we have as social scientists to really understand and kind of get at behaviors and what people are actually doing. And especially in a cross-national sense. This enables us to look at, in this case, the 27 member states in the European Union. So that's most of the information that we look at. We also, because we're interested in how the media plays an effect here. In other words, if the media is positive and has a positive disposition towards Europe, again, how that influences what voters are doing. And so there was a media study that was done in 2009, along with this European study, looking at media outlets across the European Union and how they're covering Europe. In other words, are they covering it, are stories more positive, are they more negative, are they more neutral, etc. So we're able to use this to look across the European Union as well. So that's sort of the core of the information that we have. All right, so again, what we're trying to figure out, right, is the dependent variable, right, is the question, is if voters are sticking with their party, if they're switching, right, or if they're abstaining, right? So that's the question that we're looking at. And then we have a whole list of independent variables, right, of things that we think are affecting whether voters are switching, abstaining, or sticking, as it were. And these all reflect, obviously, the hypotheses that I went through. And just to kind of quickly go through these, again, we're looking at the distance between the voters' position on the left-right dimension and the EU dimension. And again, this is from the voters' perspective, right? This is not what the parties are saying directly, but obviously it's the voters' perspective from the voters' personal, this is where I am on that left-right scale, but then also where I as a voter think the Socialist Party is, or the Conservative Party. And obviously there's going to be some variance because it's an individual perspective, but of course that's a reflection of all sorts of information that the media, obviously, but also the party is putting out there so that the voter can say, I'm at a 6 on a left-right spectrum, and oh, the socialists are at a 3. Right, so it's based on some information, but of course that varies across individuals, right? That's not consistent because that is sort of an opinion. Approval of the government, right? So that's obviously something that we're interested in looking at. How satisfied people are with the EU. Okay, so these are some of the questions, and then we have a whole bunch of what are called sort of control variables, which I won't get into, but these are just demographic variables that influence or may influence positions and opinions about things. Things like partisanship, how aware people are, what kind of education they have, their gender, their age, things like this. And whenever we sort of look at political behavior, these are the kinds of things we are always making sure that we control for so that we're able to really focus in on what we're most interested in and that it's not about age or gender or things like that, right? So we kind of try and control for those things. And then the second set of things that we look at, right, is because we're interested in this context, right, voters are not sort of out there without being influenced by anything around them, is we look at sort of the context, right, and that's, or the system level kinds of things. And this is where we look at the polarization, right, so this is where we get at, before we get to that, the politicization, right, because that's a system level thing, regardless of where you personally find yourself on the left-right dimension or where you personally, what your personal ideas are about the European Union, right, this is something that will affect everybody in France or everybody in the UK because it's system level. So this politicization that I talked about, right, the things becoming more politicized, we measure that in a couple of ways. One is by looking at the polarization of the parties, right? So again, as I mentioned before, something is more politicized if there's less agreement on it, because it's obviously then being debated, being discussed, the media is covering it, these kinds of things. So we look at how polarized the parties are on the EU, okay? And the more polarized they are, in other words, one being very much in favor of integration, one being very opposed, for example, heightens that, the importance of that, makes the EU more polarized, and again, as we said before, will affect vote choice. We look at the tone of the campaign, again, sort of for that politicization kind of thing. And then a few other things which I won't necessarily get into to just kind of control for certain things. Obviously, if a country has compulsory voting, right, that's important when we're thinking about abstention, right? Because if you have to vote, like you do in Belgium, you don't have the choice. Well, you have the choice, but you're fined, or there's some other sanction if you choose not to vote, right? So we have to keep that in mind. Okay, so that's how we kind of approach this. And we put this to look at this, do some statistical analyses through, and this is some of the results that we come up with. So what this is, you're all thinking, that's a lot of numbers, what is she what this is what are called predicted probabilities, okay? So we do a statistical analysis, and at the end, we end up with a very large table with lots of numbers, which I'm not showing you. You'll be very happy with that. And from that, from that, we want to be able to say something that actually has meaning. And so what we do are what are called predicted probabilities, where we have all of these variables in a model, and we look at when these variables are, let's say, at a certain level, okay, so very high, very low, etc., what the probability is of a certain behavior. Okay, so that's all this is. The numbers in the parentheses are confidence intervals, just how confident we are with that number, but we can sort of not pay attention to those, but we can focus on that top number. And so only half of this was to show up at once, but ignore the bottom for the moment. But the top is looking at switching. And you can see that the two distance things, right, that's testing that sincere voting, right? So again, the bigger the distance, the more between you and your party, both on the EU or on the left-right, the more likely you are to switch or abstain. And then we have the protest, right? Again, I don't like what my government's doing. I'm not satisfied with the European Union. The more likely that I'm going to switch or abstain. Okay, so what this shows us is that looking, for example, there we go, up here. There we go, looking up here. What this is saying is that if the distance between you and the party is at a minimum level, okay, so looking across all voters, putting it at the minimum, a voter has a 25% likelihood of switching, okay? So if we put it at the low end, right, a voter is 25% likely to switch, but 75% likely to vote for the party that they voted for in the national election, right? So the default is voting the way that you voted in the national election, but you are 25% more likely to switch your vote if distance is at its minimum. If we move over to here, what we see is if distance is at its maximum, you're boosted up almost to 30%, right? So we're still not talking, right? Someone is not 85% likely to switch their vote, right? But 5% more likely to switch their vote if we're looking at the largest the distance, on the high end of distance on the EU dimension. Okay? We find actually a bigger result when we look at the left-right, which is the next one down here. 25% likely to switch if we're at the minimum level of distance on the left-right dimension, but it goes up to 34% at the high end. Okay? So generally what this tells us is that the larger the distance is between you and your party, whether it's on the left, right, or the EU dimension, the more likely you are to switch, right? Which makes sense, right? And perhaps what we would expect voters to do. So it's always good when voters do what we sort of expect them to do and don't do strange things. And we see on the protest dimension, right, the opposite, right? So in other words, the more satisfied you are, right? So the more satisfied you are with your government, the less likely, the more satisfied you are, the more likely, or the less, I'm getting myself confused here. The more satisfied you are, the less likely you are to switch your vote. And the same thing with the EU, okay? So we're seeing that, again, these sincere and these protest preferences are sort of playing out as we might expect them. And at the bottom down here, there we go, this is abstaining, okay? And the numbers don't look all that different, right? So this isn't really helping us necessarily sort of pull apart what's going to make you switch more versus abstain, okay? Because the numbers are somewhat similar, right? If you are at the low end on that sort of distance between you and the party, you're 26% likely to abstain versus 31%, right, on the other end. So we're finding sort of similar kinds of things. But what this tells us is that whether it's a sincere preference or a protest preference, this is having sort of similar effects on what you're likely to do in the European Parliament election. And so it's based both on a sincere preference, but also a protest preference for different voters. Okay? All right, so then what we're interested in is taking these voters and sort of putting them into these contexts that I talked about. So how polarized the elections are on the European Union dimension, what the tone of the campaign looks like, etc. Okay. These all weren't supposed to show up at once, so we'll just focus on the top ones. So what these are showing you, so you can ignore sort of the numbers generally in all of this, but we're just sort of looking at the direction of the lines here. And again, we're looking at taking those personal preferences and combining them with the context level kinds of things. Okay, so at the top here, we're going to look at, looks like I'm we have abstaining in these two up here. This one over here is looking at party polarization. This one is looking at tone. Okay, and so let's focus on this one first. And what this is called, it's a marginal effect. Okay, so what this means over here, that the larger, that the probability of abstaining increases both with how polarized the system is and how far you are on the EU dimension from your party. Okay, so the bigger the polarization is, the more likely you are to abstain at any level of distance between you and the party. Okay, so what this is really saying, if you're sort of thinking, okay, what did she just say, is basically that this is this combination, right? This interaction of me being at a certain place, a certain distance from the party and that I voted for, and how polarized the system is, right? And so at every level of distance, the more polarized the system is, so the more polarized the parties are, the more likely I am to abstain. Okay? So that's what we're seeing here, and what we're seeing down here was switching also. Okay? So that upwards line in the middle, the dashed lines are the confidence intervals, in other words, how confident we are. So the closer they are to the black line, the better. So some of these we have more confidence in than others. But again, generally sort of the pattern that we expected to see is that the more polarized the system, right, the party system, the more politicized it is, the more likely that that distance is going to make you abstain or switch. Okay? And then over here, what these are showing is the tone of the campaign, okay, of the campaign coverage. So we go from being negative to positive, okay, and neutral as well. And what we find is that the more positive the campaign tone, okay, so the more pro-Europe, the less likely you are to either switch or abstain given a certain distance between yourself and the party, okay? So you might be at, let's say, a 5, your party is at, let's say, a 3, but if the tone of the campaign, if you're being primed in a positive way, you're less likely to switch or abstain. You're more likely to just stick with the party that you voted for. Okay, so it's both a combination of your sort of personal preferences, but also what the media is telling you to do as well. Okay, and the more positive it is, the less likely, and that's what this is both showing us. Okay. All right. So what this, generally is showing us in general is that voters are, when they go and they vote in the European Parliament elections, it's based both on their sincere preferences for some, based on protest preferences for others, but that it's importantly influenced by what's going on around them, right? So that it's not just, I don't like what my party is doing, that I'm far away from my party on this issue, but it's also what's going on in the system as well. And that'll have important implications for European elections more generally, which I'll get to in a second. Okay, so the last one of these, and then I promise no more pictures, is when we look at that last expectation about a voter being dissatisfied with the European Union, and again, how that works in the larger context. So we find that there's actually no relationship when it comes to switching. So there's no effect of the media or of party polarization and how satisfied or dissatisfied you are with the European Union when it comes to switching. So here's where we actually find a little bit of a difference between switching and abstaining. Okay, so there's no effect whatsoever, which means that no matter how dissatisfied you actually are, it doesn't matter what's kind of going on in the context of things. Which makes sense, right? Because if you're dissatisfied with the EU, it's a protest, right? You don't need a whole lot of information from the parties. You don't need a whole lot of information. It's just sort of, you're kind of pulling all this in, just a hunch sometimes, or just by a little bit of information. I don't like what the EU is doing. I have a negative perception of the EU. I don't need to be primed by what's going on around me. So that generally makes sense. But with abstentions, we find a little bit of evidence that that's going on. So this over here is looking at party polarization, and it's a pretty flat line, which means there's not a whole lot of an effect. Okay, it's not completely flat. If it was flat, there'd be no effect, but there's not much of one, and these confidence intervals are quite big. So there's not much going on there. Over here, though, this is looking at the tone of the campaign again, and here we find a little bit of evidence that as the tone of the campaign is more positive, you're going to be less likely to abstain, even if you're not satisfied with the European Union. Okay, so it's taking that personal preference and saying, but if the tone of the campaign is slightly positive, I'm going to be less likely to abstain. I'm going to be more likely to vote for the party that I voted for. So we have a little bit of evidence here that the context matters. Okay, all right. Now that I've shown you many pictures, so why do we care about all of this? All right. So the sort of summary of all of this is that we saw that both for the sincere sort of ideas and both those protest motivations will change what voters are doing between the first order, the national elections, and the second order elections, right? Those sincere preferences or those protest preferences. That motivations, though, are importantly mediated by context level factors. Okay, the tone of the campaign, the polarization, right? Just the politicization of Europe. And importantly, that parties play an important role in this story, right? That parties are actually shaping the choices that voters are making in EU elections, right? Whether that's by, let's say, directly, the sort of party polarization kind of thing. In other words, right, one party has one position, one party has another position. We know obviously that the parties are influencing the coverage in the media, right? The media is responding to the parties, and their influence and their coverage is influenced by the parties. It's obviously filtered through the often ideology of the newspaper, right? Especially in Europe, we know that news sources are often have a very strong ideological preference, but much of the cues they're taking are from the parties. And so if we care about democracy in Europe, right? So like here's the big kind of takeaway and the big sort of so what, right? Why does this matter more generally? If we care about democracy in Europe, it's a good thing that domestic parties are shaping the role or shaping what voters are actually doing, right? And moreover, the fact that the parties are cueing the voters about Europe is good for Europe as an institution, right? So something that has long been talked about within the European Union, both by practitioners, by scholars, is what's called the democratic deficit, right? That Europe was formed by bureaucrats, right? By bureaucrats, by government leaders, and that the citizens have sort of taken a while to kind of catch up. In other words, to feel European, to vote on European issues, right? And this is often, what we call this democratic deficit, because if you have this institution and the members of this institution, right, the citizens and the voters don't identify with it, there's a bit of a disconnect. And if when they go and vote, they're voting on national level issues, again, that doesn't bode well for kind of democracy more generally in the European Union. So the fact that the parties are campaigning on Europe, right, the fact that voters' behaviors are affected by what the parties are doing, right, their positions, the tone of the media, etc., is a good thing if we normatively care about European democracy, right? That voters are actually behaving and voting in a way that we might expect them to in the election that they're voting for. So this study, again, just based on 2009, gives us some evidence that this is the case, right? That the voters are listening to the parties on Europe, and that's influencing what their choices are. And we can expect that to continue happening in future elections. So to conclude, what does all of this tell us about the elections that are coming up next summer, spring, summer? Well, one, that Europe matters, right? So if we care about Europe, then this shows us that, right, that, as I said before, that this shows us that voters are actually thinking about Europe. And so that in the next election, we can imagine that parties' positions on Europe are going to very much influence what the results are. Now, we know that most elections in Europe in the last 3-4 years have very much focused on Europe, right? They've been about the Eurozone crisis, they've been about deficit, they've been about austerity, but with that, with sort of a hint of Europe, right? Blaming one country, taking credit for if you are that country, etc., right? And so we can expect that in the European elections that Europe is going to continue to play a big role in what divides the parties in terms of that polarization, right? So that Europe is going to continue to be politicized, with parties on the left having certain positions about the crisis, about the Eurozone, about austerity, parties on the right having different positions. And that's that idea of polarization, and so that voters will pick up on that, and that will influence how they're voting, right? So again, good for Europe, right? So we can expect that to happen in the next election. We can also expect, perhaps, that turnout is going to increase, right? We all know that if people tend to care more about the outcome, they're more likely to vote, right? This is still a second-order election, so turnout is never going to be as high as it is in a national election. But voters have been primed that Europe matters because of all of the economic issues that have been going on, and because national elections, right, think of the Greek election last year, for example, have really been focused on European issues, and voters have really been primed that the left thinks this way, the right thinks this way, and then there's a group of parties that don't like either of those positions that are offering a third way, which in some cases is pulling that country out of the European Union, right? Sort of those are not just Eurosceptic parties, but anti-Europe parties, right? So again, we can expect turnout perhaps to increase. Now, at what level, I don't know, but it was at a low of 43% in 2009, so really the only place to go is up from there, generally. So we can expect that perhaps to happen. And then finally, as I just mentioned, if voters don't like what's on offer from the socialists, the conservatives, the major parties in their countries, and have been primed by this in their national elections, we can imagine that we're going to see more support for these Eurosceptic parties, right? So, which again is sort of supporting what we would expect, the second order expectation that I mentioned at the beginning, right? That voters are likely to vote for smaller parties, right? One, because they can perhaps do better. And originally this idea was voters are going to vote for smaller parties because the European elections don't matter, so why don't I vote for a smaller party? They're going to go to Brussels, I don't know what they're going to do there, it doesn't really matter. But what we can expect is that because voters have been primed so much on this issue of Europe, on the Eurozone crisis, etc., that this third option from the Eurosceptic parties is going to play much more of a role for some voters. It's going to bring them to the polls. It's going to perhaps cause them to switch what their national preference was to parties like Golden Dawn in Greece, to the National Front, to the Alternative for Democracy in Germany, right? So some of these parties that are explicitly Eurosceptic, and voters will be more likely to vote for them because they've been primed that Europe matters and that this is where we can make a difference. So these are just some speculations of what might happen in the 2014 election. But in general, I think what we're going to see is that voters are going to be voting more based on Europe and less based on their national elections than we have in the past, with the sort of footnote that European issues have become national issues, and national issues have become European issues, right? So then this becomes a question of if we can pull these things apart, or if we're sort of past that, and that we now are seeing elections that are being fought both at the national level and the European level on similar things that are both where national issues and European issues are sort of tied up together. So that's all I have for you, and be happy to take questions. And I have this thing that I'm supposed to give you if you have questions, so a microphone. So I'll pass this so we can pass this around. Yeah, over here. I don't forget to give you the thing.
Thank you. I was wondering about the exact mechanics of how small parties recruit support, especially from countries that don't have small parties. I think it's particularly interesting with the UK that the UK obviously doesn't have any small parties, or they don't really play a role at all. Yet when the first European elections were held with the system of proportional representation, the Greens gained 15%, which is astoundingly high. Where does that support come from if there's no large, well-organized national party that can prime voters for that?
Oh, it's a very good question. And the UK is a very interesting example of that. So, some of where we find small parties and where we don't, obviously, and is often tied to the electoral system. And in the UK and in France, because we have a system like in the US, a first past the post system, smaller parties have a harder time not only forming, but sort of taking root and actually getting elected. The British Greens, for example, have one seat in the British Parliament, which was a big success story for them in 2010 when they got one person in. But this is a parliament of over 600 people, and you have one Green. So she doesn't have much influence over things. They do, however, have two MEPs, but out of a delegation of 72, right? So proportionally bigger. And one of the reasons that they're able to do that is because the European elections are all proportional, right? So that makes it easier for smaller parties in a place like the UK and a place like France to actually get individuals elected because the electoral system is different. This has only been since '99, and before that we saw, we didn't see much representation from these smaller parties. So to your question, which is a very good one, is how do they mobilize people when they don't necessarily have sort of that national support, the national organizations, etc. Well, some of the way that they do this is to say, because of the electoral system, we can't have a whole lot of representation. We can't really do much in the national parliament. But given that there's proportional representation, we can actually get elected. We can actually make a difference in the European Parliament. And so they very much use that as a sort of organizing tool and as a campaigning tool. And the other thing that they often do, and especially the Greens, is they go and they look at civil society groups, right? They know that there's a lot of support. The environment is actually a very big issue in the UK. And they use the civil society groups to reach people that otherwise may have only voted for, let's say, the Labour Party or the Liberal Democratic Party because of the constraints of the system at the national level, to use their contacts and things like that to basically make the claim that we know you care about these issues, and we're the party that's really going to be the one that is going to offer you what you want on these issues. And hey, we have this European Parliament thing, right, where we can actually get elected, right, and where actually the Greens generally have done quite well and have been able to influence policy cross-nationally. So it's very much sort of playing up this the second order nature of the elections, as well as the electoral system of the European Parliament, that they're able to do that. The other sort of way that a lot of these parties do this is that they're specifically Eurosceptic parties, right? So there's several parties in Denmark and Sweden called the June List parties. There's the UK Independence Party, and they're specifically parties organized to run in European elections. They don't run in national elections, although the UKIP party is saying they're going to actually run in all constituencies in the next British elections. But they're specifically organized to contest at the European level. And so they, again, attract voters just based on those issues, and again, because they can get representation. So it's kind of using the system and being sort of recognizing what exactly is going on is often how we're going to do that. Yeah. Pass the.
Thanks. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about the growth of support for Eurosceptic parties. It seems a bit counterintuitive that parties that are anti-Europe are being organized specifically to be only participating in the European Parliament. Do you expect that these parties will have growth in turnout and then plateau, or will they have a long-lasting impact?
Yeah, you've hit on a very interesting sort of contradiction, right? Which is they're sort of organizing to be against Europe, to have representation in Europe, and that's quite interesting actually in and of itself, which is that they want to actually reform the European Union, European Parliament from within, right? And effectively trying to gut some of what the European Parliament is doing from the inside. Which is sort of an interesting tactic. And these parties have been around in some form for most of the history of the European Parliament. Some of them are not just sort of Eurosceptic parties organized just for the European Parliament elections. There are the far right, for example, that are obviously in many European countries that have representation in national parliament, parties like the FN in France, the FPO in Austria, etc. But we see sort of this new crop of parties that's very much focused on Europe and focused on reforming the EU from within, or interestingly, in the case of the UK Independence Party, actually pulling the UK out of the EU, which is kind of interesting because they have representation in the Parliament right now. And I think as long as we have the EU, and as long as the major parties, right, the Conservatives, the Labour, the Socialist parties in most countries, as long as they're generally in favor of Europe, which they generally are, there's some variation, obviously I mentioned the British Tories, but generally they're in favor of Europe, and as long as we have those parties, there's going to be a space in the party system for these Eurosceptic parties, so that voters have a place to basically go if they don't support Europe more generally. So I think we're going to continue to sort of see these develop and not take over as one of the major parties in the European Parliament, but as long as the major parties sort of continue with their positions, I think they'll continue to get some representation. Again, not huge amount of representation, but 2, 3, 4 seats in a given country. You would.
So, dovetailing off of that question a little bit, part of the reason that you mentioned that the Eurosceptic parties are growing in the EP is that EP elections are second order. Voters state that they don't have that much impact on their day-to-day lives, whereas, so they're more likely to vote for them than at their national elections. Mm-hmm. But these sort of third-way parties, they don't really have that much power to influence the things that they're campaigning for. So what evidence, if any, have you seen that this is translating down to the national level, down to the elections that, quote unquote, matter?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and there's sort of a lot of perhaps sort of irony and contradiction in kind of what is going on with voting for sort of Eurosceptic parties, etc. So the one thing that we definitely are seeing is that these smaller parties that are, let's say, Eurosceptic are getting experience in the EP. In other words, they aren't able to get necessarily elected at the national level. But what we're seeing is that they are getting individuals into the European Parliament. They're gaining a sort of credibility as a party. They are gaining credibility as a serious party and not just a sort of a one-off protest party. And so then what we're seeing then is that these parties then are able to, or getting more representation at the national level, where they can then perhaps influence policy. Again, not necessarily to the extent of joining a government, but having some sort of critical mass in, let's say, in the parliament. What we are seeing too in the European Parliament too is that even though these parties are not that large, they're able to work with some of the larger parties, sort of the exceptions to the rule. In other words, the larger mainstream parties that are more Eurosceptic, right? So some of the larger conservative parties in Eastern Europe, for example, the British Tories, that kind of thing. So they're sort of building coalitions with these guys, these parties that actually, have some clout, have a decent number of seats to try and influence policy from within, and again, hopefully that will then trickle down in terms of what the voters are seeing at the next national election. Of course, this only works if the parties prime the voters in this way, right? So it only works if the parties are priming the voters and saying, hey, look, we have representation here, this is what we're doing, this is what we did, that sort of thing. Because without that, voters still are generally fairly unaware of what's going on in the European Parliament, even though increasingly with various treaty reforms, etc., it's becoming much more of an important institution and increasingly influencing national level legislation also. But it's again up to the parties to prime the voters, to educate the voters about what's going on, because if they don't, oftentimes it just kind of gets lost. Yeah.
I was wondering if you saw any big differences between countries on the national level in this kind of analysis.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a very good question. We do see some difference between the West and the East, right? So, or sort of old Europe, new Europe, and really what that is sort of the 10 accession countries. But we do find that there's less polarization on the issue of Europe, and the expectation is that that's going to increasingly grow. But that because the countries just joined, that generally both the left and the right are in favor of Europe, right? So they, because often they campaigned on it, right? This is what, in terms of getting their voters to support it, et cetera. So we see polarization actually mattering less, and that the media, again, having less of an influence on what voters are actually doing. And again, given the history of many of these countries, sort of having that sort of free and open press is still a fairly new, still fairly new, and voters are still, again, there's a learning effect of how long it takes for example, voters to use the media and sort of see that there are different perspectives on things and things like that. So we do see that those context level things don't matter as much in the 10 new accession countries, more so in sort of the original member states, those countries that have been in the longer. So, and we might expect, again, this time around, that to change a little bit, right? Because they've been in longer, we are seeing differences between the parties and things like that. So.
I was also wondering what you think the effect of age is on the election, what it will be on the next elections, because the next elections will be the first elections in which Europeans born after the Maastricht Treaty are eligible to vote, people who have been raised on a much heavier diet of European identity and who probably don't remember the national currencies, only the euro. How will that affect the turnout? What do you think?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I like that idea of being raised on a diet of Europe. That's a nice image. But yeah, no, absolutely. And so, what we generally, would expect is that younger voters are going to be more likely to be voting, and that's generally what we find, is that younger voters are more likely to think about Europe when they go and vote. And so in what we've looked at, that would mean that they're thinking about if they're sincere voters, they're thinking about how they differ from their parties on Europe. If they're protest voters, they're thinking about sort of satisfaction with Europe, did it do what it's supposed to do, that sort of thing, and really being influenced by what's going on around them. And so the expectation then is that generally, as sort of a population, younger voters are more in favor of Europe, but at the same time are more primed to look at what their national parties are doing on Europe, and if they are upset by it, to vote against them, right? So again, we're going to see more voting based on Europe and less on national elections. Mm-hmm. In terms of turnout, younger voters, as we know, obviously tend to vote less everywhere. But again, and this is the job of sort of the parties, right? If the younger voters are given a reason to go and vote, right, that parties really do differ on the issue of Europe, right, that's going to get them to the polls, right? And if the parties kind of converge on the center or converge on the middle, all sort of sound basically the same, there isn't a whole lot of polarization, right? The media isn't showing the differences, that we know that they're going to be less likely to vote. So if they get to the polls, they're going to be focusing more on Europe, but it's again the job of the parties to kind of get them there. Good question. Yeah.
Commonly cited reason for, Thank you. Commonly cited reason for voter apathy towards the European Parliament is its relative weakness and lack of symbolic weight compared to other European institutions. Do you see a change in that perception?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So again, I think that's sort of the job of the parties, the job of Europe to basically to educate voters on this. So I think one thing that, again, is an education thing though, is that because the Parliament is going to be voting on the new Commission president right after the next election, right, there's a way to really show voters, hey, what you're voting on in the European Parliament elections is really going to influence what Europe looks like, what Europe does, not just Parliament, the executive, etc. And the parties, the Party of European Socialists, which is all the big left-wing parties, and the EPP, the party of all the conservatives, have already started talking about potential candidates, right? You're already seeing in the news some of the big names on the left and the big names on the right of who they're going to support. And so I think that that's one way of making that sort of change and showing voters that, hey, what you're doing in the European Parliament elections is actually has an effect on the executive to some extent, right? Which is what most European voters are used to. In other words, voting in a general election and the executive coming out of that general election. And so that should resonate with voters. In other words, that, hey, they're choosing an executive, sort of, I mean, in the European context. But again, that has to be, voters need to figure that out, right? And so it's the job of the parties, it's the job of the EU, it's the job of the national governments, right, to educate voters on that. And again, perhaps then heightening the awareness of what the European Parliament does. But until, really until that happens across the board, voters still won't see the EP as mattering that much, right? But it's very much sort of an education campaign to show that the EP really is an important institution. It's an increasingly important institution. But again, there needs to be some way of conveying that to the voters. So, yeah.
I have sort of a broad question about voter turnout. I know that the U.S. tends to have relatively low voter turnout, and countries that have very, very high voter turnout still have questions of democratic legitimacy. What are we shooting for in terms of EU voter turnout, and is size of a polity related to voter turnout?
That's a very good question. I don't have a very good answer, but it's a good question, and it's sort of a question of what level do we need to get at to sort of where we'll sort of feel comfortable, right? Which is kind of normative, right? That it's a legitimate election, right? We can probably all agree that 43% is pretty abysmal, right? And then that's pretty low in terms of the number of people that are participating in the election, voicing their opinion, having some concern either with Europe or with their national elections, etc. But at what point are we kind of comfortable that it's an election that is representative? And obviously that is going to vary with all sorts of things, right? So in the U.S. context, if we got our turnout up to 65%, people would be really happy with that, right? That's sort of what it used to be in the 60s, and it's kind of gone down from there. But you say that to, many of you who are not from the U.S., and 65% still sounds like it's a pretty low number. So it really depends on the context and perhaps where you've been and where you're going. And within the EU, it's never been as high as it is in many national elections, right? The highest it ever was 62%, which is again what we would expect in, a second order election, right? Where voters really just don't see how important the election actually is. And what's interesting, and perhaps this is the democratic deficit or legitimacy issue, that as the EP has become more important as an institution, turnout has gone down, right? So perhaps that's kind of a crisis of legitimacy, and the question is, whose fault is that? Is it the voters' fault? Is it the party's fault? Is it the government's fault? I always like to point fingers, but what's the mechanism, right? What's actually causing that? Because you would think that as the institution matters more, right, and that if voters see that it affects what they're doing in their day-to-day lives more, that they're more likely to go and vote. And that's kind of the classic argument about voting, right? If you care about the result, then you're likely to go. So that's sort of an interesting question in and of itself. And in terms of where, and turnout does vary across countries, right? So I mentioned that 43% was the average, right? The low was 20% actually in a couple of actually the East European countries. So that argument I gave you at the beginning, that first election, people are going to run to the polls and be all excited to vote in this new election, that didn't hold everywhere. And then again, that's very country specific, right? In terms of what's, opening the box of the given country in terms of what's actually going on. But on the other end, there were some countries where it was 75 or 80%, right? Luxembourg, for example, right? Turnout was quite high. Quite high there, quite high in Germany, actually, not quite that high. But so, again, sort of thinking about what's actually going on in these countries themselves in terms of what is considered high or low turnout. And again, some of it's sort of where the country was, how does that compare to national elections, right? So if turnout in national elections is 50%, if we're getting a similar amount in EP elections, that's actually pretty good, right? So it's very relative to the context. So we have to kind of unpack that number a little bit. But if national turnout is 80% and then EP turnout is only 35%, okay, then we have an issue, right? And so that's where we, can go from this sort of big picture kind of thing, which is what I've been talking about, to really then look at the countries themselves and what exactly is happening, the institutions, the culture, the history, that kind of thing, to sort of look at some of the variation. Yeah.
So have you noticed sort of any correlation in the country-specific voting patterns sort of between, I guess, the relative power of the country within the European Union and voter turnout? You mentioned it was pretty high in Benelux, in Germany, less so in Eastern Europe, and that sort of tracks with the influence they have.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. The UK, however, is maybe the outlier here, where the UK has a fair amount of influence if we're looking at the number of seats that they have. Right there, I think they have 70, 72, what I mentioned before. So they have a decent percentage of seats within the EP, but that doesn't track with turnout or support for the EU. Right, so that's the UK is a bit of a special case in that respect. But generally, the sort of larger the representation of the country within the European Parliament, we tend to see slight increase in turnout, right? Because again, this is the sort of job of the government, of the parties, etc., to sort of say, hey, we go and vote. We're going to have, we as Germany, we as wherever are going to have a decent amount of influence in what's going on. It tends to track a little bit more in terms of turnout and not quite as much in terms of support for the European Union. So that doesn't quite follow as much. People might come to the polls, but they may be no more likely to be sort of supportive of Europe or less. That doesn't necessarily affect them. But yeah, no, that makes sense. But again, it's getting that information to the voters, because again, most voters, if you were to ask the average voter in any European country, even where we have high turnout, who are your members of the European Parliament, right? How many seats does the Netherlands have in the European Parliament, right? What does the European Parliament do? And generally it's kind of like stairs, or some guesses that are, based on other information, right? So again, it's sort of that education campaign. As I suppose the caveat, most voters don't know that about their national parliaments either, right? So, the information divide is not that great. You tend to know a little bit more about national elections, national level sorts of things than European, but it's not a huge divide. So, make that part of it clear. Yeah.
I guess just one more question. Sure. You keep saying that it's the job of the parties. It's the job of the parties, job of the government, job of somebody to inform the voters. But how exactly do you see them going about doing that? Or I guess what's going to be the push to get them to change from what they have been doing previously to what you say they need to be doing?
No, that's a good question. And it's again not to say, voters obviously have agency, of course, too, and it is the responsibility of the individual to get information too. But increasingly, just in general, we know that voters need the help of a party, a civil society group, something to kind of inform them. So I think in terms of if the parties or any of these institutions are going to start educating more, start sort of informing and getting people to the polls more, there has to be some push on their end. So in other words, let's say that voters, we know through, let's say, polls, or the parties know through polls that voters really care about Europe, right? They don't necessarily know a lot of the specifics, right? But they have maybe a European identity, that they care about the ability to travel between countries, that think Europe is a good thing, right? There's a lot of polls that ask this kind of thing, right? Is Europe a good thing? Is membership of your country a good thing, right? And obviously, of course, good thing, bad thing means something different for everyone. But the more that parties see that voters are caring about this, right, the more they perhaps then can use that as, a sort of push to change what they're actually doing, to sort of channel that. Okay, voters are already kind of there, and now we can kind of push them in the direction that we want them to by informing them about what's actually going on. And it's not just, okay, I care about Europe, Europe is a good thing, membership is a good thing, but that, okay, let's take that and now vote in the European Parliament elections, right? Actually act on that behavior. And parties, so they respond to voters. Parties also, of course, respond to losing, right? So parties often will change their tactics, change their positions if they've lost an election, right? If there's some sort of exogenous shock to the system that is changing preferences and of both the voters and the parties. Let's say the parties aren't doing what they've been doing. It doesn't continue to work, right? That's when we see parties changing their behavior, changing their tactics, that kind of thing. So I think it's both kind of from the bottom up and also from, in some respects, the top down. So if they're not doing well in national elections, voters seem to have opinions on things, seem to care about Europe, seem to care about the European debt crisis, have an opinion on this, sort of taking that and channeling it into getting voters to the polls, on Europe, as well as making it clear that they have a different position, right? So again, this is an important part of what parties can do to say, our position on austerity is this. The socialists, however, they think about this, right? So if you care about this issue, it's important to come and vote for us because otherwise you're going to get something you don't want, right? So it sort of comes from all of these kind of different perspectives in terms of when parties are going to, from when the parties are going to start doing something different. The other things you mentioned, or that I mentioned, the government, the institutions of Europe, obviously, institutions of Europe, have a goal of trying to get people to think more about Europe and be more European citizens, right? So that push just needs to continue. And, from government's perspective, again, the parties that are in government in national elections, that get elected in national governments, tend to be pro-Europe, right? And again, that's why we tend to see these Eurosceptic parties as a result of that. If they're if voters are not supportive of what the parties are doing. And so being able to sort of capitalize on that sort of support and getting voters to be more aware of what's going on and where change on Europe can really happen. So some ideas of how that might happen. Anything else?
Anyone else have any questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you guys.